Welcome to SEDF 704, Diversity in Adolescent Development. In today's lecture, we'll explore how adolescents learn to navigate the social world through moral reasoning, group dynamics, and relationships with authority, and how these processes are shaped by identity, culture, and context. Adolescents don't make moral decisions in isolation. Their choices, whether to conform, resist, obey, or speak up, are deeply tied to who they believe they are, and how their brains are wired and developing, and how they think through complex situations. As we've seen, adolescence brings heightened emotional sensitivity and powerful goal orientations, both which influence how young people respond to peer pressure, rules, and ethical dilemmas. We'll begin by distinguishing between morality and ethics and introduce Kohlberg's theory of moral development using the classic Heinz dilemma to understand how adolescents justify their decisions. We'll also reflect on critiques from feminist and cultural psychology that challenge dominant Western notions of moral growth. Next, we'll turn to conformity, how adolescents shape their behavior in response to peer groups. Through classic studies by Asch and Bandura, we'll see how social learning and normative influence operate in both subtle and powerful ways. Then we'll explore obedience, drawing on Milgram's famous experiments to understand how adolescents respond to authority figures in schools, families, and institutions, and what happens when following orders comes into conflict with a young person's emerging moral compass. We'll also look at Zimbardo's prison study, which shows how quickly individuals internalize roles and expectations in social systems, revealing how obedience isn't just about following orders, but also about identity, power, and environment. What ties morality, conformity, and obedience together is the constant negotiation between internal processes like emotion, cognition, and motivation, and external pressures like group dynamics and authority. Adolescents are figuring out not just how to act, but who to be. Finally, we'll spotlight a range of adolescents whose experiences bring these concepts to life. Children of incarcerated caregivers, immigrant students navigating assimilation and acculturation, teens facing peer pressure around underage drinking, and those drawn into movements with extremist or rigid belief systems. Across these diverse cases, we see how morality, conformity, and obedience are not just abstract ideas, but lived processes shaped by identity, context, and power. To begin, let's define two key terms, morality and ethics. While they're often used interchangeably, they mean different things in psychology. Morality refers to an individual's sense of right and wrong. This is usually shaped by upbringing, culture, religion, and personal experience. Ethics refers to formalized rules about right and wrong, like school policies, laws, or professional codes of conduct. This difference matters for adolescents who may be following their moral compass while still breaking the rules, or obeying authority even when they feel it's wrong. For example, a student might refuse to dissect a frog in biology class because it goes against their personal or religious beliefs, even though the assignment is required. Another student might go along with it, not because they agree with it, but because they fear the consequences of saying no. But what if the stakes were much higher than a biology assignment? What if an adolescent was asked to make a serious moral decision, like the kind posed in the classic Heinz dilemma? The Heinz dilemma states, Heinz's wife is very sick and needs a special drug to survive. The drug is available, but it's extremely expensive, 10 times what it costs to make. Heinz tries everything he can to raise the money, but comes up short. The druggist refused to lower the price or let Heinz pay later. In desperation, Heinz considers breaking into the store to steal the drug. The dilemma ends with two questions. Should Heinz steal the drug? Why or why not? Depending on where you are in your moral development, you might answer these questions differently, not just in terms of what you do, but why you believe it's the right choice. That reasoning, not the answer itself, is what matters most in understanding adolescent moral growth. To understand how people respond to moral dilemmas like this, psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg developed a theory of moral development in the late 1950s. His work, published in 1958 as part of his doctoral dissertation, was based on interviews with children, adolescents, and adults who were presented with dilemmas like Heinz's to explain their reasoning. What made Kohlberg's work unique wasn't whether people said Heinz should steal the drug, it was how they justified their answers. Through analyzing patterns in these responses, Kohlberg proposed 6 stages of moral reasoning, grouped into 3 levels: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. Each stage reflects a different way of thinking about rules, consequences, and ethical responsibility. Let's walk through Kohlberg's 6 stages of moral development using Heinz's dilemma to illustrate each one. Remember, the point isn't whether someone says Heinz should or should not steal the drug. It's why they think that way. What is their justification? That why tells us where they are in their moral reasoning. The first level is pre-conventional morality. At this level, morality is externally controlled. Adolescents or even children are thinking about consequences like punishment or reward, not bigger questions of ethics. Stage 1 is the obedience and punishment orientation. Right and wrong are determined by what avoids punishment. A typical Heinz response at level 1, stage 1 might be, he shouldn't steal the drug because he'll get caught and go to jail. Here, the concern isn't about life or fairness, it's about avoiding punishment. At the same level for stage 2, the instrumental relativist orientation or self-interest stage, the focus is on personal benefit or fair exchange. What's in it for me? A person might say he should steal the drug because he needs his life to live. After all, people need 2 incomes to survive. The reasoning is still self-centered, but this starts to consider the role of others in the justification. The second level of Kohl's moral development is conventional morality. Now morality is shaped by social roles and expectations. Adolescents at this level are concerned with how they're seen by others and with following rules to keep society stable. The first stage in level 2, or stage 3 in the system overall, is the good interpersonal relationship stage, sometimes called the good boy, nice girl orientation. Right behavior is what helps you fit in or be seen as a good person. A Heinz response might sound like, he should steal the drug because a good husband would do anything to help his wife. The focus is on maintaining relationships and meeting social expectations. The second stage in the conventional morality level, and the 4th stage in the system overall, is maintaining social order, or the law and order stage. Here, morality means following the rules and respecting authority. A person might say, he shouldn't steal the drug because laws exist for a reason. If everyone broke them, there'd be chaos. This stage reflects a strong belief in law, duty, and social order. The third level is the post-conventional morality level. This is the most advanced level, where people think beyond rules and focus on abstract ethical principles. The first stage in level 3 and the 5th stage in the system overall is the social contract and individual rights stage. People at this stage believe rules are important, but they can be challenged if they violate basic rights. A Heinz response might be, he should steal the drug because human life is more important than property. The law isn't fair in this case. The second stage in the post-conventional morality level and the last stage in the system overall is the universal ethical principles stage. This is the highest form of moral reasoning, guided by internal principles of justice, dignity, and equality, even if it makes breaking the law. Someone might say, he should steal the drug because saving life is a universal moral obligation, no matter the cost. These stages aren't just about age. They reflect how we learn to think about morality through experience, reflection, and sometimes real struggle. Understanding where students are in this progression can help us respond not to just what they do, but why they do it. Now that we've explored Kohlberg's stages, it's worth asking, Whose experience shaped that theory and whose were left out? Psychologist Carol Gilligan raised exactly this concern in the early 1980s. Gilligan had worked closely with Kohlberg and respected his contributions to moral psychology. But when his assessment instrument was administered on a larger scale, researchers noticed a pattern. Females often scored a full stage below their male counterparts. This wasn't because women and girls were less moral, but because they were reasoning differently. While Kohlberg's dilemmas emphasized abstract justice rules and individual rights, girls and women were more likely to value maintaining relationships, preserving connections, and considering the needs of others. In interviews, their moral reasoning often focused on finding a solution than avoiding harm while keeping people together, something Kohlberg's scoring system didn't value as highly. In response, Gilligan developed what became known as the ethics of care. Introduced in her 1982 book, In a Different Voice, Gilligan argued that traditional theories of moral development reflected a male-centric view of ethics, one focused on logic, universality, and detachment. But many people, especially women, reason morally through empathy, care, and rational context. She also criticized the very design of Kohlberg's research. His dilemmas centered on an individual protagonist, like Heinz, and asked participants to identify with Heinz's perspective. For younger or more relationally focused participants, the setup made it harder to step back and consider broader ethical dilemmas. The dilemmas didn't reflect how many people actually encounter moral questions in the middle of relationships, responsibilities, and emotional realities. While Kohlberg eventually expanded his research to include more female participants and even worked with Gilligan for a time, he kept most of his dilemmas very similar to the original design, and the justice-based scoring system remained mostly unchanged. Gilligan's ethics of care offered something new, a new way to understand moral development as contextual, empathetic, and relational, not just rule-bound. It challenged the idea that abstract thinking alone defines moral maturity. And this matters for educators. When students make decisions based on loyalty, care, or responsibility to others, they may be demonstrating moral sophistication, not weakness. Gilligan's work reminds us that moral growth is not one size fits all, and how students reason is as important as what they decide to do. Gilligan's work also connects to broader critiques of Kohlberg's theory, especially from cross-cultural psychologists who have argued that his dilemmas reflect a distinctly Western emphasis on individual rights and harm. In many other cultures, moral development is shaped more by collective responsibility, spiritual duty, or family obligations, all things largely left out of the original model. So in the end, Gilligan's contribution isn't just about gender, it's about redefining what counts as moral reasoning and making space for care, empathy, and connection as central ethical values. Let's look at how both these morality models can help us understand the moral reasoning of adolescents who are often left out of traditional psychological research, like youth with incarcerated parents. Imagine a 15-year-old girl named Patricia whose father is in prison. One day, her teacher assigns a debate on criminal justice reform. Patricia is asked to argue in favor of stricter sentences and policies, even though she believes those same policies tore her family apart. From a Kohlbergian perspective, we might expect Patricia to reason through abstract principles. Is it legal or just? And what's fair for society? But Patricia's reasoning might sound different. She might say, I know some people think it's fair, but my dad wasn't a bad person. He made a mistake and we've all paid for it. I don't want to say something that makes it harder for other kids like me. I care about what this does to families. Here, Patricia's moral stance isn't about breaking the rules. It's about staying loyal, protecting her loved ones, and avoiding harm to others that are like her. She's thinking relationally and not abstractly. She's weighing the consequences not in terms of rights and laws, but in terms of connection, empathy, and emotional responsibility. And that's exactly what Gilligan's theory helps us name. This is moral reasoning also. It's not just the kind of reasoning that Kohlberg's framework easily captures. Understanding this lens is essential for educators When students, especially those impacted by incarceration, poverty, and trauma, make decisions based on care, loyalty, or relational harm, they may be acting with deep ethical insight, even if their choices don't look rational in a traditional sense. Gilligan helps us see that morality isn't always about laws or logic, but it's also about love, care, and relationships that everyone is trying to protect. Now let's talk about conformity, changing one's behavior to match a group. In adolescence, conformity becomes especially powerful as peer influence intensifies. And honestly, if you've ever stepped foot in a middle school or high school, you know exactly what I mean. Conformity is everywhere. You see students with matching shoes, haircuts, slangs, poses. One week it's crop tops and baggy jeans, and the next it's a viral dance or a way of speaking. These patterns might look superficial on the surface, but they're doing important social work. So what exactly is conformity? Conformity is when a person adjusts their behavior, beliefs, or appearance to match a group norm. This isn't necessarily about pressure. It can be subtle, even unconscious. And in adolescence, it's often driven by what's called normative influence, the desire to be liked, accepted, and seen as part of the group. This kind of conformity helps adolescents explore and express their identity. It tells them, these are my people. This is where I belong. We see this in things like group selfies, coordinated dances on TikTok, and even the "who wore it better" posts on social media. Fashion is one of the clearest signals. The work of Hans Eckelboom, a Dutch photographer working in New York City, captured this brilliantly. He walked through the city photographing strangers in public, creating visual spreads that showed dozens of people wearing the exact same outfit, completely unaware of each other. A flannel shirt here, a trench coat there, a sea of Nike Dunks. It wasn't forced, it just happened. Why? Because trends are social cues. They help us signal the world we're part of. Office workers wear suits. Sneakerheads wear Jordans. Our clothing, our speech, and even our behavior say something about our affiliations. Let's go deeper into two classic theories that help us understand why adolescents conform: Bandura's social learning theory and Asch's conformity experiments. Albert Bandura was one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century. He developed social learning theory, which emphasized that people learn by observing others. He argued that behavior isn't just shaped by direct reinforcement, like rewards or punishments, but also by watching what happens to other people. This is especially true during adolescence, a time where peers become more influential than parents in many contexts. Bandura's most famous experiment is the Bobo doll study, which involved children watching an adult model either act aggressively or gently towards an inflatable doll. Children who saw the adult hitting or kicking the doll were much more likely to imitate that aggressive behavior themselves, even when the adult wasn't present. More importantly, the effect was even stronger when the aggressive adult model was rewarded, or weaker when the aggressive adult model was punished, showing that consequences experienced by others also shape whether the behavior was imitated. This shows that modeling matters. Kids didn't need to be told what to do. They just learned it through observation. Now let's apply this to conformity. Imagine a student sees a classmate get attention, likes, or social praise for wearing a specific brand or posting a certain kind of video. That student may start to imitate that behavior, not because they were told to, but because they learned vicariously that it brings approval. Bandura called this vicarious reinforcement. This process plays out constantly in middle school and high school. One student starts using a slang word, and soon the whole group picks it up. A team posts a filtered selfie and gets hundreds of likes, so then now everybody is filtering their selfies. Bandura's theory helps us understand why trends spread and why social modeling is so powerful, especially when identity is still forming and peer approval feels so essential. Now let's look at the work of Solomon Asch. In the 1950s, he conducted one of the most famous studies in social psychology, one that showed just how far people will go to fit in, even when they know something is wrong. In Asch's experiment, participants sat in a room with several other people who were actually actors. They were shown a simple line comparison task, one line on the left and 3 lines on the right, labeled A, B, and C. The task was to say which line matched in length. It was easy, and there was an obvious answer. But then something strange happened. One by one, the actors began intentionally giving the wrong answer. When it came time for the real participant to respond, they were faced with a decision: go along with what everyone else said, or say what they knew was the right answer. Over multiple trials, about 75% of participants conformed at least once, giving an obviously wrong answer just to feel like they were part of the group. They later reported feeling unsure, anxious, or afraid of standing out. This is what we call normative social influence, conforming because we want to be liked, accepted, or at least not rejected. Asch's study revealed that even in low-stakes situations with strangers, people will conform. Now imagine the stakes for a teenager surrounded by their peers, people they have to face every day in school, on the bus, and in group chats. The pressure to fit in isn't theoretical, it's social survival. And the fear of being different? It's enough to override what someone knows is true. So what do Bandura and Asch teach us? Bandura helps us see how conformity happens through modeling. We copy behaviors we see others rewarded for. Asch shows us how conformity happens through pressure. We go along with the group, even though we disagree internally. And in adolescence, both these processes are happening at once. A student might conform because they've seen what gets social rewards, or because they fear being judged or left out. In both cases, they're managing the tension between being authentic and being accepted. As educators, we can help students reflect on that tension. We can ask, why did you make that choice? Were you following someone else's lead? Were you afraid of standing out, and why? Helping students understand these influences is the first step towards empowered, intentional identity development. Let's look at a scenario that's familiar to many adolescents, regardless of their background: underage drinking. Imagine a 16-year-old named Jason. He's at a friend's house on a Friday night. His friend's older brother has bought alcohol for the group, and everyone's pressuring Jason to have a drink. Some people are already filming for social media. Everyone's laughing, encouraging him. Someone says, "Come on, it's not a big deal, we all do it." Jason knows underage drinking is against the law, and his parents have made it clear about their expectations. Morally, he believes this is wrong. He's also worried about getting in trouble. But at the same time, he doesn't want to be the only one that says no. This is where morality and conformity collide. Kohlbergian perspective, Jason might be reasoning at the conventional level, thinking, if I say no, they'll think I'm lame. I want to be a good friend. Or he might be at the scale of thinking in post-conventional terms. This doesn't feel right. My safety matters more than their approval. But even if Jason has strong moral beliefs, he's not immune to social pressure. That's where conformity comes in. Jason may conform not because he wants to drink, but because he fears social rejection. This is a classic case of normative influence, adjusting your behavior to be liked, not because you've changed your beliefs, but because you don't want to stand out. Imagine Jason doesn't drink, at least not at first. He's always thought it wasn't worth the risk, but then he starts seeing the party videos, classmates posting clips of themselves drinking, laughing, and goofing off. These videos rack up hundreds of views, fire emojis, inside jokes in the comments. No one tells Jason to drink, but he notices how much attention those posts get and how people in them seem more popular afterward. That's vicarious reinforcement. Watching others get rewarded for behavior makes it feel more acceptable and even appealing. Eventually, Jason starts to wonder, maybe it wouldn't be such a big deal after all. This example shows us that adolescent behavior isn't just about right and wrong. It's about belonging, approval, and identity. Conformity isn't just about peer pressure. It's about emotional safety in a world where standing out can feel like a threat. We've seen how conformity can emerge from peer pressure and the desire to fit in, like in the case of underage drinking, where identity and belonging are negotiated in real time. Let's look at a different kind of example, one that brings culture into the picture: the experience of immigrant youth in American schools, where conformity intersects not just with peer norms, but with acculturation, identity development, and cultural survival. Imagine a student named Amina. She's recently moved to the US from Somalia and is attending middle school for the first time here. On her first day, she wears a traditional long dress and brings sambusa, a favorite food from home, for lunch. As she walks to the cafeteria, she notices classmates wearing jeans, graphic tees, and sneakers. She hears snickers about the weird smell of her lunch. No one says anything cruel directly, but she sees the looks and she feels the difference. Now let's think of this through the lens of Bandura's social learning theory. Amina observes that students who wear certain clothes, speak a certain way, and carry certain brands seem to get positive social attention, laughs, inclusion, and compliments. Over time, even without being told, she might start to adjust her behavior to match what she sees rewarded. This is modeling and vicarious reinforcement, learning what's acceptable and desirable by watching others. At the same time, Asch's research helps us understand another part of Amina's experience. Even as she personally values her traditional clothes, she may begin to conform just to avoid embarrassment or rejection. She may pack a peanut butter sandwich instead of the sambusa, not because she likes it better, but because it keeps her from standing out. And for her, this conformity is seen as social survival. But it's not just behavior that's changing. Amina's identity is evolving too. Adolescence is already a time when young people are trying to answer the question, who am I? And for immigrant youth, this question becomes even more complex. They're not just choosing between trends, they're navigating the space between cultures. This brings up two important concepts that are essential for understanding how culture conformity and identity intersect, especially for immigrant and first-generation youth: acculturation and assimilation. Assimilation refers to the process of replacing one's original cultural identity with a dominant culture. It's often associating with fitting in by erasing difference, adopting the language, customs, dress, and behaviors of the dominant group, sometimes at the cost of distancing from your heritage. Acculturation, on the other hand, is broader. It involves adapting to a new culture while still maintaining your cultural identity, values, and traditions. It's not about losing who you are. It's about learning how to operate in the two worlds at the same time. These processes are not just academic terms. They show up in the lived experiences of many adolescents, and they come with real psychological stakes. Adolescents are already in a period of identity formation, asking, who am I? But immigrant youth are often forced to ask a more complicated version of this. Who do I have to be accepted here? And what part of myself might I lose in the process? When schools, peer groups, or society implicitly reward assimilation, students may start to hide their cultural identity to avoid standing out. This might look like changing their accent, refusing to speak their home language in public, or avoiding traditional clothing or food. These decisions may help them blend in, but they can also lead to internal conflict, shame, and a sense of disconnection from family or community. In contrast, students who are supported in acculturating, that is, learning to navigate multiple cultures while still embracing their own, tend to show better mental health, stronger self-esteem, and more integrated identity. This brings us back to Amina. As a reminder, Amina just moved to the US from Somalia. On her first day of school, she wears this long dress and brings sambusa for lunch. She quickly notices the stares, the awkward glances, the comments about her food. No one explicitly tells her to change, but she's getting a message. Amina might feel pressure to assimilate, to dress like everybody else, pack a sandwich and blend in, and over time she might do these things, not because she wants to abandon her culture, but just because she wants to be accepted. But what she might actually be trying to do is acculturate, which is more mentally sound. and find ways to participate in her new world without completely erasing where she comes from. She wants to preserve her culture. She's trying to find a version of herself that can belong in both places. The tension between these two goals, fitting in and staying true to yourself, shows up in small daily decisions. When we see a student like Amina changing her clothes or her lunch, it's easy to interpret it as simple conformity, but underneath that is a complex moral and emotional process, one that involves identity negotiation, cultural adaptation, and psychological risk. Understanding acculturation and assimilation helps us as educators respond with empathy, not judgment. It helps us create classrooms where students feel safe expressing both who they are and who they are becoming without being forced to choose between the two. And most importantly, it reminds us that for some students, conformity isn't just about social trends, it's about emotional safety. And that is something we must never overlook. Now that we've explored morality and conformity, let's turn to the last piece of this picture, obedience. Obedience is different. While conformity is about adjusting to a group of equals, peers, obedience is about responding to authority. It's when someone changes their behavior because they're told by someone in a position of power, a parent, a teacher, a coach, a police officer, a judge, or a boss. Here's the distinction. Morality is internal. It's guided by personal values, beliefs, and ethical principles. Conformity is horizontal. It's shaped by peer norms and the desire to belong. But obedience is vertical. It's shaped by hierarchical relationships and the expectation to follow orders. What makes obedience especially important and sometimes dangerous is that it doesn't necessarily depend on what someone believes is right or wrong. People often obey even when they feel uncomfortable or disagree internally. In adolescence, obedience can play out in complex ways. A student may obey a school rule they know is unfair because they don't want to challenge a teacher. Another may refuse to report bullying because a coach told them to stay out of it. In each case, the moral compass is overridden by the perceived power of authority. And that's why obedience deserves its own space in this discussion. It reminds us that adolescents aren't just navigating what they believe is right or what their peers expect. They're also managing the dynamics of power and figuring out when to comply, when to resist, and how to do either without losing a sense of safety or self. Understanding these distinctions, morality, conformity, and obedience, gives us a more complete picture of how adolescents make decisions and how those decisions are shaped by both internal values and external structures. Let's take a look at the classic research that revealed just how far people will go when asked to obey authority, even when it violates their conscience. Milgram, a psychologist at Yale, wanted to understand how ordinary people could participate in atrocities like those committed during the Holocaust, just because they were following orders. His question, would everyday people obey an authority figure, even if it meant harming someone else? Here's how the experiment worked. Participants believed they were part of a study on learning and memory. They were told to play the role of a teacher, delivering electric shocks to a learner that was in a different room whenever the learner answered the question incorrectly. What they didn't know was that the learner was an actor and they weren't really receiving real electric shocks. With each mistake, participants were told to increase the voltage. As the shocks supposedly escalated, the learner would begin screaming in pain, banging on the wall, and eventually falling silent. And yet, when the authority figure, the experimenter in the lab coat, calmly instructed the teacher to continue, many of the participants did. Over 65% of participants delivered the maximum voltage, 450 volts, even though they believed 450 volts would be lethal to the learner in the other room. Why? Because an authority figure told them to. Milgram's conclusion: people will obey commands even when those commands conflict with their values, especially if they feel the authority is legitimate and the responsibility is not theirs and the setting is structured. A decade later, Philip Zimbardo conducted another infamous study on obedience and authority, this time focusing on power, roles, and institutional structures. Zimbardo set up a simulated prison in the basement of Stanford University. 24 college-aged male volunteers were randomly assigned to be either guards in the prison or prisoners in the prison. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. It was actually shut down after 6 days. Why? Because the situation spiraled out of control. The guards quickly became abusive, shouting, degrading, and psychologically tormenting the prisoners. Prisoners became submissive, anxious, and in some cases traumatized, and Zimbardo himself, acting as the prison superintendent, failed to intervene. He himself had become part of the system that he was trying to study. The takeaway? People will conform to roles and obey institutional expectations, even if these roles lead to inflicting harm, if the environment normalizes or expects that behavior. In adolescence, authority shows up in many forms: parents, teachers, principals, coaches, religious leaders, and law enforcement. Some obedience is necessary for safety, structure, and learning, but research from Milgram and Zimbardo shows us that obedience can also be dangerous. For marginalized youth, this is especially critical. If a student has experienced over-policing, cultural silencing, or systemic bias, they may internalize that challenging authority is unsafe, even when authority is wrong. Or worse, they may be expected to comply with systems that actively harm them. As educators, it's our job to help students learn when obedience is necessary and when it needs to be questioned. We want them to think critically, not just comply automatically. Ultimately, moral development isn't just about what rules to follow. It's about how they make decisions when rules, peer pressure, and authority don't align. Milgram and Zimbardo taught us that even well-adjusted adults can follow harmful demands when under pressure. But what about adolescents, especially those who feel disconnected, excluded, and disempowered? Remember, adolescents are in a stage of life where they are forming their identity, seeking belonging, defining values, and navigating increased independence and external expectations. When those needs go unmet because of trauma, marginalization, family instability, or lack of meaningful connection, youth can become especially vulnerable to coercive authority. This includes not just school structures or community leaders, but also exploitive systems like gangs, extremist groups, and even cults. Why? Because these groups often provide a clear hierarchy and a sense of order, a strong identity, a tight-knit community, and simple rules and rewards. And they sometimes even identify a shared enemy. In other words, they exploit the same psychological mechanisms seen in Milgram and Zimbardo studies, but they apply them to young people who might be looking for direction, validation, connection, and a place to belong. As educators, we play a critical role in building protective factors for this type of situation. You can help students by empowering students to ask questions, not just follow orders. Adolescents need to know it's okay to think critically, to pause and to wonder, and to ask themselves, is this the right thing to do? We can also normalize dissent, reflection, and ethical resistance. It's not about encouraging rebellion. It's about showing students that respectful disagreement is a vital part of learning and leadership. Also, we can affirm their sense of identity and belonging across race, gender, language, culture, and ability, so that no student feels that they have to change who they are just to be accepted. And finally, create community in our classrooms, our hallways, and our schools, so that students don't have to seek connection in spaces that exploit their need to belong. That's how we help them grow, not just into obedient students, but into thoughtful, grounded human beings. When students are taught to recognize manipulation, challenge harmful norms, and trust their moral instincts, we're not just teaching them to succeed academically, we're protecting them from exploitation. Let's look at an example with a 17-year-old student named Eli. Eli used to be a quiet, thoughtful student who enjoyed science and current events. Recently, he's become deeply involved with an online youth movement focused on environmental justice. The group describes itself as exposing the truth, calling out corporations, governments, and even schools for their role in climate inaction. For Eli, this movement gives him something powerful, a sense of purpose, belonging, and clarity in a chaotic world. The group also has a clear social structure. At the top is an older teen who calls himself the truth leader. Members are praised for challenging authority and discouraged from expressing doubt. They repeat slogans about mainstream systems being corrupt and untrustworthy. Eli begins refusing to complete homework assignments on climate policy. He calls his teacher an agent of the system and urges classmates to walk out of class. When asked why, Eli doesn't say, "I disagree with the curriculum." He says, "They told me not to trust you. You're lying just like the rest of them." Let's pause here. This isn't just about activism. Eli's identity might have become fused with the group's beliefs. Questioning those beliefs now feels like betraying not only the group, but himself. From Kohlberg's perspective, Eli may believe he's operating at the post-conventional level of morality, placing moral principles above rules. But there's a problem. While he's committed to what he sees as justice, he's not showing empathy for others' perspectives, like his teachers. That's a critical piece missing from true moral reasoning. Milgram's obedience research helps us understand how Eli got there. He's obeying the group's leader, the so-called truth leader, without question. Even though this behavior is out of character for him, the authority figure's influence overrides his past values. We also see Zimbardo's findings come to play. Eli's role in the group as the truth fighter now defines his behavior, his language, even how he views others. Like the participants in the Stanford prison experiment, he's become the role he has been assigned. And finally, Bandura's social learning theory shows us how Eli got pulled in. Before he ever acted out, Eli saw other group members confront teachers and reject school norms, and those students were praised, cheered, and celebrated. That's vicarious reinforcement. Eli learned what earned respect in this group by watching others get rewarded. Eli might have also seen what happens to students who stayed quiet or followed the rules. They were mocked, excluded, or labeled as part of the problem. This is vicarious punishment. That kind of social threat can be just as powerful. Eli is not just drawn to the rewards. He might also be trying to avoid social punishment and protect his standing in his group. So Eli's story isn't just about defiance. It's about how moral reasoning, obedience, identity, and social influence collide during adolescence. And if we want to help students like Eli, we need to understand all the forces that shape the choices that they make. At the end of the day, Eli is doing what adolescents do best. He is searching for identity, meaning, and belonging. This group gave Eli those things, and it rewarded him for rejecting alternatives. Our job as educators isn't to talk him out of his beliefs. It's to help him engage those beliefs with more flexibility, empathy, and perspective. We could say something like, "Eli, I can tell this issue really matters to you. I'm not here to shut you down. What I want to do is help you express your ideas in ways that respect others too." Because Eli doesn't need to abandon his convictions, but he does need help learning that you can be passionate and principled without being closed off or combative. Eli's story is not about climate change or classroom disruption. It's a story about how adolescents are shaped by the voices they trust, the groups that claim them, and the adults who respond with either fear or compassion. When we support students like Eli, we're not asking them to obey us. We're inviting them to participate in a wider conversation, where obedience doesn't mean silence, and belonging doesn't require erasing other people. That's the kind of moral development we should be aiming for. Thanks for joining me today. In this lecture, we explored how morality, conformity, and obedience shape adolescent development, and why these concepts are essential for understanding student behavior and context. We examined how adolescents develop moral reasoning using examples like the Heinz dilemma, Berg's 3-level, 6-stage framework. We also introduced Gilligan's theory of care to highlight how different cultural and relational perspectives shape moral choices. From there, we looked at how conformity and obedience emerge in adolescence, not as signs of weakness, but as part of identity formation and social belonging. We discussed Bandura's social learning theory and vicarious reinforcement and punishment, as well as Asch's conformity studies and Milgram's and Zimbardo's experiments to obedience to authority. We used examples to show how these forces play out in real life and how students might be obeying rules or breaking them for reasons tied to survival, belonging, or moral conviction. By better understanding how adolescents navigate these forces, educators can support students in developing ethical awareness, critical thinking, and respectful engagement, helping them build not just knowledge, but character and community. Thank you for taking time to explore how psychological theory and diversity influence adolescent development. If you're in the course, make sure to check the syllabus and weekly announcements for updates and assignments. If you're just visiting, thank you for stopping by. I hope you'll check out the other videos in this playlist or elsewhere on the Stats with Tours channel. Wishing you all the best in your educational pursuits. Until next time, ciao!